Before the rise of palaces and empires, the Mediterranean was already a land of ingenuity and human ambition. Villages dotted fertile valleys, farmers cultivated the first crops, and artisans shaped stone and metal. By 5000 BCE, the seeds of civilization were already being sown, seeds that would one day grow into the mighty palaces of Crete, the fortified citadels of mainland Greece, and sprawling empires in Anatolia and Egypt. Yet, as the Bronze Age unfolded, this interconnected world would reach unimaginable heights and crash spectacularly by 1150 BCE. This is the story of the Mediterranean Bronze Age, from its humble beginnings to its dramatic collapse. At the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the Mediterranean was a patchwork of human communities on the cusp of transformation. The scattered villages and small farming settlements that had dotted the Aegean islands, the Greek mainland Anatolia, and the Nile Valley for millennia were now giving way to a new kind of society, one defined by monumental architecture, organized political hierarchies, long-distance trade, and the earliest experiments in writing. This period, known as the Early Bronze Age, circa 3000 to 2000 BCE, laid the foundations for the civilizations that would dominate the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. On the island of Crete, a remarkable civilization began to take shape. By around 3000 BCE, the inhabitants of Crete had transitioned from small Neolithic villages into more complex settlements, setting the stage for what would later become the legendary Minoan civilization. Archaeological evidence shows early communities clustering along fertile plains and coastal areas, taking advantage of the island's natural harbors to facilitate trade and communication. These early Minoans developed advanced techniques in agriculture, cultivating wheat, barley, olives, and grapes, and domesticating livestock, including sheep, goats, and cattle. They crafted pottery with increasing sophistication, decorated with geometric and natural motifs that hinted at an emerging artistic sensibility. The early settlements gradually evolved into more complex palatial centers, which by c. 2000 BCE would blossom into the grand palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea. The Minoans' mastery of the sea was central to their success. Their ships plied the waters of the Aegean, the Cyclades, and beyond, carrying pottery, textiles, and metals to Egypt, Anatolia, and other Mediterranean regions. This maritime trade was not merely economic. It facilitated cultural exchange, transmitting ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations that would influence neighboring regions for centuries. The prominence of ships in Minoan art underscores the society's identity as a seafaring power. Architecturally, the Minoans innovated with multi-story buildings, central courtyards, and complex drainage systems. Their palaces, with labyrinthine corridors and rooms for storage, administration, and ritual, suggest highly organized governance. Frescoes depicting religious ceremonies, nature, and bull leaping, possibly a form of ritual sport, demonstrate a society deeply invested in both ritual and aesthetic expression. Notably, many Minoan palaces lacked fortifications, implying a culture that relied more on diplomacy and maritime dominance than on military aggression. By c. 2500 BCE, the Minoans had developed a proto-writing system known as Cretan hieroglyphs, which would later evolve into linear A around 1800 BCE. Though undeciphered, these scripts indicate an advanced bureaucratic culture capable of recording trade, religious rituals, and administrative details. While Crete flourished, the Greek mainland was undergoing its own transformation. The early Mycenaean culture began to emerge around 2000 to 1600 BCE, influenced heavily by the Minoans, yet distinct in its focus on fortified settlements and martial prowess. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Lerna, Tiryns, and Mycenae reveals a society organized around citadels, where stone walls enclosed palatial centers and storage facilities. These early citadels were not only military strongholds, they were administrative hubs. Excavations have uncovered storage jars, tablets, and evidence of organized labor that suggest a centralized bureaucracy managing agriculture, trade, and religious rituals. By c. 1600 BCE, the Mycenaeans had fully adopted and adapted aspects of Minoan culture, including elements of art and religious symbolism, while maintaining their hierarchical warrior-based society. Trade was crucial to Mycenaean prosperity. They imported raw materials such as gold, ivory, and copper from Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia, and exported products like olive oil, wine, and ceramics. This interconnectivity allowed the Mycenaeans to consolidate wealth and power while simultaneously absorbing ideas and innovations from the broader Mediterranean world. Their early use of linear B, derived from Minoan linear A, facilitated the management of complex economic and administrative systems, recording inventories, taxes, and allocations of labor. To the east, the Anatolian plateau was witnessing the emergence of the Hittite civilization. Around 1600 BCE, Indo-European-speaking peoples migrated into central Anatolia and gradually coalesced with local populations, giving rise to a powerful state centered on Hattusa, near modern-day Boğazkale in Turkey. The Hittites developed a highly stratified society, with a king at the apex, supported by nobles, priests, and military elites. This hierarchy is reflected in the Hittite laws, which emphasize justice, property rights, and the protection of the vulnerable. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was fortified with massive walls and monumental gates, reflecting the strategic importance of defense in a region of competing city-states and tribal groups. Within its walls, temples, palaces, and archives facilitated religious, administrative, and diplomatic activities. The Hittites maintained correspondence with neighboring powers, including Egypt and Mesopotamia, often through formal treaties and marriage alliances. This network of diplomacy and trade enabled the Hittites to secure resources such as tin and copper, essential for bronze production. Hittite society was technologically and culturally sophisticated. They excelled in chariot warfare, used cuneiform writing adapted from Mesopotamian scripts, and maintained extensive archives detailing administrative and legal matters. Their economy relied on agriculture, pastoralism, and trade, integrating Anatolia into a broader Mediterranean economic sphere. In northeastern Africa, the Nile Valley saw one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. Around 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under the first pharaoh, marking the beginning of the early dynastic period. This unification established a centralized state capable of coordinating agriculture, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade. The new capital, Memphis, sat strategically at the apex of the Nile Delta, controlling the fertile lands and the trade routes linking Egypt to the Levant and beyond. The pharaohs wielded immense authority, viewed as divine intermediaries between the gods and their subjects. Egyptian society was highly hierarchical, with a ruling elite of nobles, scribes, and priests overseeing artisans, farmers, and laborers. Religion permeated every facet of life. The pantheon of gods governed natural and social order, while temples and shrines facilitated ritual practices that reinforced the pharaoh's authority. Hieroglyphic writing emerged during this period, enabling detailed records of administration, religious ceremonies, and historical events. This innovation would provide a foundation for Egypt's monumental inscriptions and chronicles in later millennia. The early Bronze Age was marked by a technological revolution. The widespread use of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, transformed agriculture, warfare, and craftsmanship. Bronze tools and weapons allowed for more efficient farming, stronger fortifications, and superior armaments for armies and chariot units. Writing systems advanced across the Mediterranean. Egyptian hieroglyphs documented religious texts and state administration. The Minoans developed Cretan hieroglyphs, evolving into Linear A by 1800 BCE, while the Mycenaeans adopted Linear B around 1450 BCE for administrative purposes. In Anatolia, cuneiform was adapted for Hittite record-keeping. These systems not only managed economies, but also preserved cultural memory, ritual practices, and diplomatic correspondence. Trade networks expanded dramatically, linking Crete, mainland Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant. Minoan and Mycenaean ships transported pottery, luxury goods. By around 2000 BCE, the Mediterranean had transformed into a network of thriving societies, each carving out its place in a rapidly interconnecting world. Crete, under the Minoans, had become a center of maritime power and cultural innovation, while mainland Greece saw the emergence of the Mycenaeans, a warrior-based civilization forging citadels atop its hills. These two cultures, although distinct, were profoundly intertwined through trade, migration, and cultural exchange, setting the stage for a period of unparalleled creativity, prosperity, and eventual fragility that would define the Bronze Age. On Crete, the Minoans had evolved from early agrarian settlements into complex palace-centered societies. By 2000 BCE, settlements such as Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were flourishing, their palaces serving not only as administrative centers, but also as hubs of religion, craft production, and maritime commerce. Knossos, the largest of these, sprawled over several hectares with multi-story buildings, expansive courtyards, storage magazines, and intricate plumbing systems, including clay pipes and drainage systems that reflected sophisticated engineering for the era. The Minoans' architectural prowess, combined with their artistic sensibility, is evidenced in vivid frescoes portraying sea voyages, religious ceremonies, bull-leaping rituals, and depictions of flora and fauna, indicating a society that celebrated both nature and ritualized performance. Minoan society relied heavily on the sea. Their merchant fleets traversed the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean, connecting with islands such as Thera, modern Santorini, the Cyclades, and Cyprus, and reaching as far as Egypt and the Levant. Pottery, finely crafted ceramics, and luxury goods were exported, while raw materials such as tin, copper, and gold were imported to support bronze production and artisanal crafts. The centrality of trade not only enriched the Minoans materially, but also allowed cultural motifs, artistic styles, and religious practices to diffuse across the Mediterranean. Maritime dominance created an environment of relative security and prosperity, evident in the lack of fortifications at most Minoan palaces, suggesting confidence in naval defense and diplomacy. By c. 1800 BCE, the Minoans had developed a writing system known as Linear A, used primarily for administrative record-keeping. Though still undeciphered, Linear A tablets show a sophisticated bureaucracy capable of managing resources, trade, and religious offerings. Temple archives, storage records, and inventories demonstrate a society deeply invested in organization, wealth management, and ritual obligation. Beyond administration, Minoan religious life appears centered on goddess worship, nature deities, and ritualized ceremonies such as bull leaping, which may have been a rite of passage or a display of civic and religious cohesion. Sacred caves, peak sanctuaries, and palatial shrines indicate the interweaving of natural landscapes with spiritual practice, a hallmark of Minoan culture. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans emerged more fully by 1600 BCE, though Proto-Mycenaean settlements had existed for centuries prior. Influenced by Minoan trade and culture, the Mycenaeans absorbed aspects of art, architecture, and religious motifs, but developed a distinctly militarized and hierarchical society. Citadels such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes rose atop defensible hilltops, their cyclopean walls constructed of massive limestone blocks intended to intimidate enemies and assert authority. These palaces were administrative and military centers, coordinating agriculture, trade, craft production, and warfare. Linear B, adopted from Minoan Linear A around 1450 BCE, served as the script for record-keeping, revealing complex bureaucratic structures managing palace estates, inventories, taxation, and labor organization. The Mycenaeans excelled in warfare, chariot technology, and fortified construction, creating a culture that revered martial skill. Warrior elites dominated political life, with the Wanaks at the apex, supported by local lords, soldiers, and artisans. However, their society was not solely defined by conflict. Trade played an equally central role, with Mycenaean ships and merchants transporting olive oil, wine, pottery, and other goods across the Mediterranean in exchange for gold, ivory, and exotic materials from Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. These interactions facilitated cultural exchange, allowing the Mycenaeans to absorb and adapt Minoan religious symbolism, artistic styles, and technological innovations. The period from 2000 to 1450 BCE witnessed a remarkable interconnectivity between Minoans and Mycenaeans. Mycenaean elites often visited Crete, bringing back knowledge of palatial administration, craft techniques, and religious practices. Archaeological evidence, such as Minoan-style frescoes and ceramics in mainland citadels, suggests a deliberate cultural assimilation and admiration for Minoan sophistication. Conversely, Mycenaean warrior motifs began appearing in Cretan art, illustrating a two-way exchange that shaped the identities of both civilizations. Minoan and Mycenaean societies were also deeply embedded in wider Mediterranean networks. Cyprus provided copper, essential for bronze production, while Egypt offered gold and luxury goods. The Levant supplied timber, resins, and spices, creating a trade web stretching thousands of kilometers. Merchant fleets braved storms and piracy to sustain these networks, and diplomatic marriages and treaties facilitated formal ties. These interactions fostered economic growth, but also created interdependencies that would later exacerbate regional vulnerabilities. Technology advanced in parallel with trade. The mastery of bronze metallurgy allowed the Minoans and Mycenaeans to produce superior weapons, tools, and ritual objects. Archaeometallurgical evidence from Crete shows the careful alloying of copper and tin to produce durable bronze, often in specialized workshops under palace supervision. Mycenaean warriors wielded bronze swords, daggers, and spears, while ceremonial items such as gold diadems and intricately carved vessels reflected both status and religious significance. Religion continued to shape social cohesion and governance. In Crete, goddess worship and ritualized ceremonies were often tied to palatial authority, legitimizing elites while reinforcing civic participation. The Mycenaeans adopted a pantheon influenced by Minoan deities, yet introduced martial cults and hero worship, emphasizing lineage, valor, and palace loyalty. Both cultures held ceremonies that likely involved processions, offerings, and possibly theatrical or athletic displays, reflecting the fusion of civic, religious, and aesthetic life. Despite their achievements, the Minoans and Mycenaeans faced challenges. Crete, while rich and powerful, relied heavily on maritime trade, leaving it vulnerable to disruption or naval threats. Mainland Greece contended with internal strife, local rebellions, and the logistical difficulties of maintaining fortified citadels across rugged terrain. Environmental pressures, including periodic droughts or soil depletion, likely strained agricultural output, requiring careful management and trade to sustain urban populations. Archaeological evidence also hints at occasional conflict. While Minoan palaces were mostly unfortified, some sites like Zakros showed defensive measures, and mainland citadels were heavily fortified from the outset. The spread of Mycenaean influence across the Aegean, including limited incursions or settlements on Crete and other islands, suggests a blend of trade, diplomacy, and military assertion. These tensions, though not catastrophic in this period, foreshadowed the later struggles that would culminate in the late Bronze Age collapse. Art and culture flourished alongside administration and trade. Minoan frescoes and pottery depict marine life, religious rituals, and elaborate athletic displays, reflecting both an aesthetic sensibility and a spiritual worldview. Mycenaean art, while incorporating Minoan motifs, often emphasized martial themes, lineage, and funerary practices, including shaft graves and tholos tombs filled with gold, weapons, and ceremonial objects. The interplay of artistic styles reveals a Mediterranean world increasingly defined by interaction, imitation, and adaptation. Linear A and Linear B scripts illustrate the administrative sophistication of these civilizations. Tablets from Knossos and Pylos record inventories of grain, olive oil, textiles, and precious metals, as well as allocations of labor and taxation. These documents reveal highly organized economies capable of supporting large populations, monumental construction projects, and extensive trade networks. The existence of scribes, clerks, and palace bureaucracies underscores the complexity of governance and the reliance on literacy and record-keeping. During this period, around 1600 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans reached their peak. Palaces were at their most elaborate, trade networks were at their widest, and cultural achievements, art, religion, administration, and craftsmanship were fully realized. The Mycenaeans, concurrently, consolidated power on the mainland, developing fortifications, expanding trade, and creating a warrior aristocracy that would dominate the Aegean. This era of interconnectivity, prosperity, and cultural sophistication represents the height of the Minoan-Mycenaean Mediterranean, a world that seemed throughout this period. The Mediterranean world was defined by interdependence, innovation, and cultural synthesis. Palaces and citadels served as hubs of governance, religion, and economy. Maritime trade linked distant regions, spreading technology, art, and ideas. Writing systems allowed for record-keeping, administration, and cultural continuity. Artistic expression reflected both the spiritual and material priorities of society. At the same time, the very structures that enabled prosperity, the concentration of power, reliance on trade, and interlinked economies, introduced vulnerabilities that would later contribute to widespread collapse. The Minoans and Mycenaeans, in their peak centuries between 2000 and 1450 BCE, illustrate the dual nature of human civilizations: innovation and complexity, achievement and fragility. They were societies capable of producing monumental architecture, intricate bureaucracy, and profound art, yet they remained acutely sensitive to environmental, political, and economic pressures. Their legacy would not vanish entirely. Rather, it would be absorbed and transformed by subsequent Mediterranean cultures, echoing across the centuries in the palaces, fortresses, and artistic motifs of the later Bronze Age. By the dawn of the 16th century BCE, the Mediterranean had become a web of civilizations, each vying for influence while interconnected through trade, diplomacy, and warfare. The Eastern Mediterranean, in particular, was dominated by emerging powers whose political, economic, and military ambitions would shape the region for centuries to come. Among these were the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the powerful Egyptian New Kingdom, and a constellation of city-states and ports along the Levantine coast, including Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre, which facilitated trade across the sea. The interplay between these powers, their economic dependencies, and their cultural exchanges created both a flourishing Mediterranean world and, unknowingly, the conditions for its future instability. The Hittites, centered in central Anatolia, were ascending to the height of their power by the early 15th century BCE. Around 1400 BCE, under kings such as Mursalai and Hattusili III, the Hittites controlled vast swaths of modern-day Turkey, northern Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was fortified with massive cyclopean walls and monumental gates, reflecting both the architectural ambition and the constant threat of conflict in Anatolia. The Hittites wielded formidable military power, particularly through their use of chariots and composite bows, which allowed them to dominate both plains and mountainous regions. Their armies were organized hierarchically, combining professional soldiers, conscripted levies, and allied contingents from vassal states. Hittite kings were both political and religious leaders, mediating between gods and their subjects, and reinforcing their authority through treaties, oaths, and ritualized diplomacy. Trade and diplomacy were central to Hittite strategy. The Hittites maintained extensive correspondence with other powers, often recorded in cuneiform tablets on clay, detailing treaties, marriages, and exchanges of gifts. Tin and copper, essential for the production of bronze, were particularly important, and control over these resources allowed the Hittites to maintain both economic and military supremacy. The Hittites also engaged with the emerging Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations, exchanging goods, adopting artistic motifs, and navigating the delicate balance of influence across the Aegean and Anatolia. To the south, Egypt was entering its New Kingdom period, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, a time of imperial expansion, monumental construction, and extensive diplomacy. Pharaohs such as Thutmose III, r. 1479 to 1425 BCE, led campaigns deep into the Levant and Syria, establishing Egyptian dominance and ensuring the flow of tribute, trade, and resources. Thutmose III's military expeditions demonstrated remarkable organizational skill, moving thousands of troops, chariots, and supplies across arid landscapes. By contrast, Ramesses II, r. 1279 to 1213 BCE, often remembered for his longevity and monumental building projects, consolidated Egyptian power while facing persistent threats from neighboring regions. Egyptian armies heavily reliant on infantry, archers, and chariots projected authority over the Levantine corridor, the Sinai and Nubia, creating a network of vassal states and client kingdoms that fed Egypt's wealth and reinforced the pharaoh's divine authority. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, city-states such as Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, Syria, emerged as hubs of trade and diplomacy. By c. 1400 BCE, Ugarit had established itself as a critical intermediary between Egypt, the Hittites, and the Aegean. The city's port facilitated the exchange of timber from Lebanon, tin from Anatolia, and luxury goods from the Aegean, while local artisans produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork for export. Ugarit also played a role in the development of writing. The Ugaritic alphabet, emerging around c. 1300 BCE, is one of the earliest known phonetic scripts, influencing later Semitic writing systems and demonstrating the city's role as both a commercial and intellectual hub. Phoenician ports, including Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, expanded trade networks further along the Levantine coast. These cities specialized in timber, purple dye, glass, and luxury items, acting as both suppliers and cultural transmitters across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians' maritime skills allowed them to navigate open waters, establishing trade networks reaching Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean, which facilitated not only the exchange of goods, but also ideas, religious motifs, and technological innovations. The interconnection between these civilizations was unprecedented. Egyptian artisans adopted Anatolian and Aegean techniques. Hittite scribes used cuneiform borrowed from Mesopotamia, and Aegean art bore motifs inspired by both Egyptian and Anatolian cultures. Trade was not merely economic, it was cultural and political, allowing the exchange of religious concepts, artistic styles, and administrative practices across vast distances. This interconnectedness fostered wealth and innovation, but also made the region susceptible to systemic shocks. A disruption in one area could reverberate across the Mediterranean, affecting trade, political stability, and social cohesion. By c. 1300 BCE, signs of stress began to appear. The Hittite Empire faced internal turmoil, including succession disputes, revolts in vassal states, and pressures from northern Anatolian tribes. Egypt, despite its formidable power, contended with uprisings in Canaan, incursions by nomadic groups, and the administrative burden of maintaining distant territories. In the Levant, city-states such as Ugarit faced increasing pressure from regional instability and the growing threat of seafaring raiders, later identified in Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples. Archaeological evidence suggests fortifications were expanded, settlements were burned, and trade networks were under strain during this period. The Hittites' reliance on a complex bureaucracy and centralized control, while a source of strength, also created vulnerabilities. Supply chains for bronze, tin, and copper were extensive but fragile. Disruption in one region could compromise military readiness and construction projects. Similarly, Egyptian campaigns relied on the steady flow of tribute and labor from conquered territories. Localized famine, drought, or rebellion could disrupt these systems. In the Levant, city-states depended on maritime trade for both subsistence and luxury goods, making them sensitive to naval disruptions or piracy. Diplomacy became both a tool and a necessity. Treaties, such as those documented in Hittite archives, illustrate a Mediterranean world governed not only by force, but also by negotiation, marriage alliances, and tribute. The famous Treaty of Kadesh, circa 1259 BCE, between Ramesses II of Egypt and Hattusili III of the Hittites exemplifies the delicate balance of power in the region. Signed after the Battle of Kadesh in Syria, this treaty established borders, mutual non-aggression, and formalized relations, representing one of the earliest recorded examples of international diplomacy. It underscores both the interconnectedness and the fragility of Eastern Mediterranean powers. Military confrontation could escalate, yet negotiation remained essential to maintaining stability. Religion and culture were deeply entwined with politics. The Hittites adopted a pantheon influenced by Anatolian and Mesopotamian deities, incorporating foreign gods into their state rituals. Egyptian pharaohs, considered divine, centralized religious authority, commissioning temples, monumental inscriptions, and ritual events that reinforced their power. Ugarit and Phoenician city-states maintained local religious practices while facilitating exchanges of iconography, deities, and ceremonial practices with neighbors. These shared religious motifs facilitated cultural cohesion and legitimacy, linking political authority to spiritual sanction across the Mediterranean. Technologically, this period saw innovations that reinforced power and wealth. Chariot warfare, developed in Anatolia and refined in Egypt, allowed states to project military force efficiently. The Eastern Mediterranean between 1600 and 1200 BCE was thus a paradox of strength and vulnerability. Hittites, Egyptians, and Levantine city-states commanded vast resources, sophisticated militaries, and extensive trade networks. Cultural, religious, and technological exchanges flourished, enriching societies and reinforcing hierarchies. Yet this same interconnectedness created systemic fragility. A disruption in trade, a military defeat, or an environmental stressor could propagate rapidly, destabilizing the entire network. Archaeological evidence, including burned palaces, abandoned settlements, and shifts in material culture, hints at the mounting pressures that would eventually culminate in the widespread Late Bronze Age collapse. The story of the Eastern Mediterranean during this era is one of ambition, diplomacy, and interdependence. The Hittite Empire's centralized authority and military innovation, Egypt's expansive campaigns and monumental constructions, and the commercial acumen of Levantine ports collectively illustrate a world at the height of complexity. Cultural exchange and technological progress are intertwined with politics and warfare, creating a civilization network both resilient and precarious. The triumphs of these societies, from monumental temples to alphabetic writing, would echo for centuries. Yet, their vulnerabilities, rooted in environmental pressures, economic dependencies, and the inherent risks of interconnectivity, would soon transform prosperity into crisis, heralding a period of collapse and uncertainty that would reshape the Mediterranean landscape forever. Between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world reached a level of interconnectivity and economic sophistication previously unseen in human history. This was the era of the Golden Trade Network, an intricate web of exchange linking the civilizations of Crete, mainland Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant. Goods, ideas, artistic styles, and technological knowledge flowed across the seas and overland routes, fueling prosperity and innovation. Maritime skill, political negotiation, and economic acumen became just as crucial as military strength, and the success of entire civilizations increasingly depended on the health and continuity of these interlinked networks. Crete, under the Minoans, remained at the center of this exchange. By c. 1500 BCE, the palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea had reached architectural and administrative sophistication, functioning as hubs for collecting and redistributing resources. Minoan ships, equipped for long-distance travel, carried ceramics, textiles, olive oil, and wine to ports throughout the Aegean, the Cyclades, Anatolia, and as far as Egypt and the Levant. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian sites, including pottery sherds and fresco depictions, confirms the presence of Minoan traders in the Nile Delta and along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These voyages were perilous, navigating open seas with early sailing technology and relying on celestial navigation, wind patterns, and coastal landmarks. Success depended on both seamanship and political connections, as access to foreign harbors required negotiation with local authorities or tribute to local powers. The Mycenaeans, emerging more prominently on the Greek mainland by c. 1600 BCE, became both traders and warriors, exploiting their proximity to fertile plains, strategic harbors, and Minoan cultural networks. Palaces like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes managed regional economies, overseeing the production and distribution of surplus grain, oil, and crafts. Linear B tablets from Pylos, dating to the 13th century BCE, reveal an extensive bureaucratic apparatus coordinating shipments of goods, allocation of labor, and management of imports and exports. Mycenaean traders navigated the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, exchanging olive oil, wine, pottery, and gold for tin, copper, ivory, and other luxury materials. Their influence grew steadily, and by c. 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had effectively absorbed much of Minoan Crete, controlling both mainland and island trade networks, consolidating power, and facilitating broader Mediterranean integration. Anatolia, dominated by the Hittite Empire, was central to the flow of tin and copper, the essential ingredients for bronze. By controlling key sources and overland routes, the Hittites ensured their armies and artisans could maintain bronze production, a critical factor in both military campaigns and ceremonial display. Hittite archives, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, document extensive correspondence with Egypt, Ugarit, and other regions, negotiating trade, marriage alliances, and treaties. Kings like Mursalai II, circa 1321 to 1295 BCE, and Hattusili III, circa 1267 to 1237 BCE, emphasized both diplomacy and military readiness, understanding that the prosperity of their empire depended on secure trade and stable relations with distant partners. Egypt, during its new kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, also thrived on trade. Under pharaohs such as Thutmose III, r. 1479 to 1425 BCE, and Amenhotep III, r. 1386 to 1349 BC, Egypt expanded into the Levant and maintained a system of tribute and trade that enriched the state and reinforced the pharaoh's divine authority. Egyptian merchants imported tin from Anatolia, cedar timber from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and luxury goods from the Aegean. In return, they exported grain, papyrus, linen, and finished luxury items. The presence of Minoan pottery and Cretan fresco influences at sites like Tel El Amarna highlights the degree of Mediterranean cultural exchange facilitated by these economic networks. Levantine ports were indispensable nodes in the Golden Trade Network. Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre functioned as intermediaries, channeling goods between the Aegean, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Ugarit's archives, written in the cuneiform alphabet around c. 1300 BCE, document shipments of grain, timber, silver, and tin, reflecting a tightly integrated trade system. Phoenician ports specialized in the export of cedar timber, purple dye, glass, and crafted goods, which were essential for Egyptian, Hittite, and Aegean elites. The Phoenicians' mastery of maritime navigation allowed them to maintain connections across thousands of kilometers of coastline, and their ports served as cultural as well as economic hubs, facilitating the spread of religious motifs, artistic styles, and technological innovations. The movement of bronze, a critical material, was the lifeblood of these networks. Tin, scarce and highly valued, was sourced from distant Anatolian and possibly Central Asian deposits, while copper came from Cyprus, the Levant, and the Balkans. Minoan and Mycenaean workshops produced bronze weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects, which were then traded or gifted to foreign elites. Egyptian and Hittite archives record the exchange of bronze, emphasizing its importance not only economically, but also politically and militarily. Control over these resources could confer both power and prestige, making trade routes and supply chains the target of diplomacy, coercion, and sometimes conflict. The Golden Trade Network also facilitated cultural and technological diffusion. Artisans learned techniques from distant lands, adopting decorative motifs, methods of bronze casting, and architectural styles. Religious concepts traveled alongside goods. Minoan and Mycenaean iconography influenced Anatolian religious artifacts, while Egyptian deities and funerary practices left their mark on Levantine and Aegean cults. This circulation of ideas reinforced elite legitimacy, as palaces and temples displayed imported goods and foreign artistic motifs, demonstrating both wealth and cultural sophistication. Despite its apparent strength, the Golden Trade Network introduced systemic fragility. The economic prosperity of the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, Egyptians, and Levantine ports depended on the uninterrupted flow of goods. A disrupted shipment of tin, a poor harvest, or an outbreak of conflict in one region could cascade across the network, affecting bronze production, trade contracts, and political stability. Evidence from archaeology, including burned palaces, abandoned settlements, and interruptions in material culture, indicates that these vulnerabilities were already manifesting by c. 1300 to 1200 BCE, foreshadowing the crises that would culminate in the late Bronze Age collapse. Maritime trade required not only technological skill, but also sophisticated social organization. Port cities maintained customs officials, scribes, and warehouses, ensuring accurate accounting of incoming and outgoing goods. Merchant fleets, often sponsored by palaces, religion, art, and culture, were inseparable from trade. Imported goods were often used in temples, palaces, and elite tombs, reinforcing spiritual and political authority. Minoan frescoes depicting maritime scenes and religious ceremonies reflect both economic engagement and cosmological worldview. Mycenaean art incorporates motifs from Crete and Egypt, signaling cultural absorption alongside economic exchange. Egyptian tombs contained imported Aegean pottery and Levantine materials, demonstrating the prestige and symbolic value of these items. Trade, therefore, was a conduit not just for goods but for ideas, rituals, and symbols that linked elites across the Mediterranean. By the end of the 14th century BCE, the Golden Trade Network was at its most extensive. Minoan palaces flourished, Mycenaean citadels expanded their reach, Egyptian military and economic influence extended into the Levant, and Anatolia under the Hittites maintained both strategic resource control and diplomatic influence. Phoenician ports acted as intermediaries, facilitating commerce and cultural transmission. The result was a Mediterranean interconnectedness that allowed unprecedented prosperity, yet the very complexity of this network made it acutely vulnerable to disruption. The interdependence of these civilizations meant that a shock in one region could ripple across the Mediterranean. Environmental stress, such as droughts or crop failures, could reduce trade surplus. Social unrest could halt production, and maritime piracy or warfare could sever critical supply lines. Archaeological evidence, including palaces with burned layers, abandoned settlements, and interruptions in trade goods, shows that cracks were beginning to form in this golden age even before the systemic collapse of the 12th century BCE. The Golden Trade Network between 1500 and 1200 BCE illustrates both the heights of human ingenuity and the latent fragility of interconnected civilizations. Maritime skill, bureaucratic sophistication, diplomatic acumen, and cultural exchange created a Mediterranean world of unparalleled prosperity. Yet the same dependence on distant partners, long supply chains, and complex political structures introduced vulnerabilities that would later prove catastrophic. The success of the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, Egyptians, and Levantine city-states rested on a delicate balance, and while the Mediterranean thrived during this era, the seeds of its vulnerability were already sown. By the early 13th century BCE, the Mediterranean world that had flourished for centuries began to show unmistakable signs of stress. The complex tapestry of civilizations, from Crete and mainland Greece to Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant, was beginning to unravel, revealing the vulnerabilities embedded in a network of interconnected societies. The period from roughly 1300 to 1200 BC marks a turning point, where the previously unbroken prosperity of the Late Bronze Age began to fray, laying the groundwork for one of history's most dramatic collapses. On Crete, the Minoan palaces, once vibrant centers of administration, religion, and commerce, exhibited evidence of repeated destruction and reconstruction. Excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea reveal layers of ash, collapsed walls, and repaired frescoes, suggesting not a singular catastrophe, but a series of disruptive events over decades. While the causes remain debated, possibilities include earthquakes, volcanic activity on nearby Thera, modern Santorini, internal rebellions, or foreign incursions. By c. 1450 BCE, Mycenaean influence began to extend over Crete, indicating both cultural assimilation and possible military dominance. The palaces, previously unfortified, may have become more vulnerable as political authority shifted or weakened, exposing the Minoans to external threats. Mainland Greece also bore the first indications of societal strain. Mycenaean citadels such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos show evidence of fortification expansions, Yet linear B tablets from this era suggest growing administrative pressures. Records from Pilus indicate heightened resource management, inventory tracking, and the mobilization of labor for defensive works, hinting at an increasingly tense and militarized society. These administrative burdens imply that the Mycenaean elites were responding to both internal and external stressors, local unrest, resource scarcity, or threats from rival polities. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, once a formidable power under kings like Mursalai II, circa 1321 to 1295 BCE, and Hattusili III, circa 1267 to 1237 BC, faced mounting challenges in the 13th century BCE. While Hattusa remained a fortified and sophisticated capital, the empire struggled with succession disputes, rebellions among vassal states, and incursions from northern and western tribes, including the Casca and Luwian groups. Military campaigns documented in Hittite archives show repeated efforts to suppress revolts and secure trade routes, but these operations strained the administrative and economic capacities of the empire. The dependence on imported tin and copper for bronze production made the Hittites particularly vulnerable to disruptions in trade, whether from piracy, environmental scarcity, or political instability in supply regions. Egypt, under the New Kingdom pharaohs, similarly faced increasing pressures. Ramesses II, r. 1279 to 1213 BCE, and his successors expanded Egyptian influence into the Levant. But the administrative burden of managing vassal states, coupled with recurring rebellions in Canaan and Nubia, created instability. By c. 1200 BCE, inscriptions and reliefs depict raids along the coast and internal unrest, highlighting the difficulty of maintaining imperial cohesion. Egypt's reliance on both tribute and trade mirrored the vulnerabilities of other Mediterranean powers. Disruptions in one node of the network could reverberate across the system, affecting military, economic, and cultural stability. In the Levant, city-states such as Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre also experienced growing instability. Ugarit, once a hub of trade and literacy, shows archaeological evidence of palace destruction, burned layers, and temporary abandonment of urban districts by c. 1200 BC. Written records from cuneiform tablets indicate interruptions in trade, shortages of essential goods, and social unrest, suggesting that even these smaller, commercially focused polities were not immune to the pressures destabilizing the larger empires. Phoenician ports faced similar vulnerabilities. While they maintained maritime trade, environmental stressors and regional conflict increasingly threatened the steady flow of goods essential for their economies. Environmental factors played a significant role in this period of crisis. Paleoclimate studies reveal prolonged droughts, reduced rainfall, and shifts in temperature across the eastern Mediterranean between 1300 and 1200 BCE. These climatic stresses would have affected agricultural yields, leading to food shortages, famine, and population pressure in urban centers. The reliance on surplus production to sustain palaces' armies and trade networks meant that a series of poor harvests could have cascading effects, reducing economic output, creating social tensions, and weakening the capacity of states to respond to external threats. Archaeobotanical and sedimentary evidence support the existence of crop failures and environmental stress, reinforcing the idea that nature compounded the vulnerabilities of these interlinked societies. Another critical factor was the emergence of external aggressors, most famously the Sea Peoples, referenced in Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, r. 1186 to 1155 BCE, but whose incursions likely began earlier, around c. 1207 BCE. These seafaring groups attacked coastal settlements, disrupted maritime trade, and challenged the authority of established polities. While their origins remain debated, possibly including Aegean, Anatolian, and Levantine groups, their impact was profound. Coastal cities across Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant faced raids, sackings, and economic disruption. These attacks strained military resources and forced states to divert attention from administration, trade, and cultural pursuits to defense, compounding existing vulnerabilities. Economic instability was already apparent before the full onslaught of invasions. Trade, which had been the lifeblood of the Mediterranean, slowed in certain areas due to the combination of environmental stress, conflict, and internal political instability. The intricate network that linked Egypt, Crete, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant became increasingly fragile as disruptions in one region affected the flow of tin, copper, grain, and luxury goods across thousands of kilometers. Archaeological evidence, including a decline in imported pottery styles and reduced long-distance exchange, indicates that the economic fabric of the Mediterranean was fraying. Evidence of social unrest also appears in material culture. Fortifications were expanded or hastily rebuilt. Palaces showed signs of burned layers or repair, and small settlements were abandoned. Linear B tablets reveal increased administrative oversight, suggesting that elites attempted to maintain control over populations under stress. In Hittite archives, by circa 1250 to 1200 BCE, the combined effects of environmental stress, economic disruption, social unrest, and external aggression created a precarious balance. The Mediterranean, once interconnected through a vibrant web of trade and diplomacy, now faced systemic vulnerabilities that would eventually lead to widespread collapse. Palaces, cities, and administrative centers bore the marks of strain, signaling that the golden age of trade and prosperity was nearing its end. Yet the processes were gradual and complex, involving multiple civilizations responding to pressures in their own ways, rather than a sudden, singular catastrophe. In summary, the period from 1300 to 1200 BCE represents a time when the Mediterranean world, long defined by interconnectivity and prosperity, began to unravel. Minoan palaces on Crete show repeated destruction, and Mycenaean citadels increased militarization. The Hittite Empire faced internal revolt and external pressure, while Egypt contended with uprisings and maritime threats. Levantine city-states experienced disruptions in trade, urban destruction, and social unrest. Environmental stress, including prolonged droughts and declining agricultural yields, compounded these vulnerabilities. Trade, the backbone of economic and cultural exchange, slowed, leaving societies exposed. Finally, the emergence of the Sea Peoples as external aggressors further destabilized coastal and maritime networks, foreshadowing the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilizations. This period of crisis illustrates the fragility inherent in complex, interconnected societies. Prosperity, innovation, and interdependence, while remarkable, carried with them systemic risks. The signs of decline were evident decades before the full collapse, revealing a Mediterranean world grappling with the convergence of environmental, political, economic, and social pressures that would ultimately reshape its history and leave an enduring legacy of lessons for civilizations to come. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the Mediterranean world experienced one of the most dramatic and enigmatic collapses in human history. The civilizations that had flourished for centuries, the Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Egyptians, and Levantine city-states, faced a convergence of environmental, economic, social, and military crises that led to the widespread destruction of cities, the disintegration of empires, and the loss of long-established cultural and administrative systems. Archaeological evidence, contemporary inscriptions, and paleoclimatic data reveal a period of unprecedented upheaval, often referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a turning point that would plunge much of the Mediterranean into a centuries-long dark age. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean palaces, once bustling centers of administration, trade, and ceremonial life, were systematically destroyed. Sites such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Orchomenos show layers of ash, collapsed walls, and signs of violent destruction dated to circa 1200 to 1180 BCE. The destruction was widespread, suggesting coordinated attacks or widespread internal rebellion, or a combination of both. Linear B tablets, which had meticulously recorded administrative details, inventories, and personnel, abruptly ceased to appear, indicating the collapse of the bureaucratic structures that had sustained Mycenaean society. With the fall of the palaces, local populations dispersed, fortified citadels were abandoned, and large-scale urban centers gave way to smaller, decentralized villages. The Mycenaeans' maritime trade networks with Crete, the Levant, and Anatolia disintegrated, severing economic and cultural connections that had taken centuries to establish. Crete itself, though already weakened by earlier Mycenaean influence and seismic activity, faced further disruption. Archaeological evidence from Knossos and Phaistos shows continued signs of destruction and abandonment around c. 1200 BCE, suggesting that the island was not immune to the regional instability. While some coastal settlements survived longer, the elaborate palace-centered administration and ceremonial complexes that had defined Minoan culture ceased to function in their traditional form. The palatial economy, dependent on centralized storage and redistribution of surplus, could not withstand the simultaneous pressures of declining trade, environmental stress, and potential external incursions, marking the end of the Minoan civilization as a dominant Mediterranean power. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire collapsed entirely. Hattusa, the capital, was abandoned around c. 1200 BCE, with evidence of destruction and burning layers indicating possible invasions or internal revolt. Hittite archives, painstakingly recorded in cuneiform, abruptly end, leaving a sudden void in the historical record. Vassal states and provincial centers, once tightly integrated under Hittite authority, fragmented into smaller political units. The Kaska tribes, who had long pressured the northern borders, may have exploited the weakening central authority, while southern Anatolia saw the rise of new, less centralized polities. The collapse of the Hittite Empire removed a major stabilizing force in the eastern Mediterranean, leaving Anatolia fragmented and exposed to both internal and external pressures. In the Levant, thriving city-states such as Ugarit and Byblos were destroyed or severely depopulated. Excavations at Ugarit reveal burn layers dating to c. 1190 BCE, suggesting sudden violent destruction, possibly by seaborne raiders. Contemporary letters from Ugarit indicate disruptions in trade and military pressure, including threats from the mysterious Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders whose attacks are recorded in Egyptian inscriptions during the reign of Ramesses III. Tyre, Sidon, and other Phoenician ports were similarly destabilized. While some survived, trade networks were fragmented, and the movement of essential goods such as timber, tin, and copper became sporadic or halted altogether. The collapse of these city-states further severed the economic lifelines connecting the eastern Mediterranean, compounding the crises experienced by mainland Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt. Egypt, while surviving the initial waves of disruption, faced repeated challenges that strained the new kingdom. Ramesses III, r. 1186 to 1155 BCE, led campaigns to repel the Sea Peoples around c. 1175 BCE, successfully defending the Nile Delta, but at great cost. Egyptian inscriptions, including the famous Medinet Habu reliefs, depict battles with a coalition of seaborne invaders from the north and west, highlighting the widespread threat posed to coastal settlements. These campaigns required enormous mobilization of manpower, resources, and logistics, which placed significant strain on the pharaonic administration and economy. Though Egypt avoided the total collapse experienced elsewhere, the political and economic disruptions weakened the state, reduced agricultural and trade surplus, and marked the beginning of a gradual decline in central authority during the later New Kingdom. Environmental and climatic factors played a critical role in the collapse. Paleoclimatic data indicate periods of prolonged drought, cooler temperatures, and reduced rainfall across the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant between c. 1250 and 1150 BCE. Crop failures, famine, and reduced agricultural yields would have placed immense pressure on urban populations and palace economies, reducing surplus available for trade, taxation, and sustaining armies. Evidence from pollen cores, sediment layers, and archaeobotanical studies suggests that the agricultural foundation of Mediterranean civilizations was severely stressed, exacerbating existing political and social vulnerabilities. The disappearance of long-distance trade networks was both a cause and an effect of the collapse. Bronze production, dependent on tin and copper sourced from Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Balkans, declined sharply as trade routes were interrupted by raids, political fragmentation, and logistical disruptions. Mycenaean palaces, reliant on imports for both economic stability and elite display, could no longer sustain their administrative and ceremonial functions. Similarly, the Hittite and Levantine economies, heavily dependent on trade, were crippled, creating a feedback loop that accelerated societal decline. The Golden Trade Network, which had once linked Egypt, Crete, Anatolia, and the Levant, effectively unraveled, isolating formerly interconnected civilizations and leaving them vulnerable to further collapse. Despite the widespread destruction, not all regions were equally affected. Egypt maintained continuity, albeit weakened, and some Levantine ports survived in reduced form. Cyprus, Anatolian highlands, and certain inland regions in Greece and the Levant retained continuity in settlement and trade, though on a smaller scale. This uneven collapse highlights the combination of local resilience, geographic factors, and social organization in determining how different societies fared during periods of systemic stress. The Late Bronze Age collapse between 1200 and 1150 BCE represents a culmination of multiple, interrelated factors. Environmental stress, including drought and famine, economic disruption due to the breakdown of trade networks, political instability and internal rebellion, military pressure from the Sea Peoples and other groups, and the fragility of complex interdependent societies all contributed to the unraveling of centuries of Mediterranean civilization. The collapse was neither instantaneous nor uniform, but the cumulative effect was catastrophic. The Mycenaean palaces were abandoned, the Hittite Empire dissolved, Ugarit and other Levantine city-states were destroyed, and Egypt, while surviving, faced long-term weakening of central authority. In retrospect, this period illustrates the inherent vulnerabilities of complex, interconnected civilizations. The very networks that had facilitated wealth, technological innovation, cultural exchange, and political influence became channels through which disruption could spread rapidly. Societies that had thrived on interdependence and trade found themselves exposed when environmental, social, and military pressures converged. The Late Bronze Age collapse stands as a powerful reminder that the foundations of prosperity, trade, centralization, and connectivity can, under stress, also be the foundations of fragility and decline. The aftermath of the Late Bronze Age collapse, spanning approximately 1150 to 1000 BCE, represents a transformative period in Mediterranean history. The once interconnected and prosperous civilizations, Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, the Hittite Empire, and Levantine city-states had been devastated by a combination of environmental stress, trade disruption, invasions, and systemic vulnerabilities. Urban centers were abandoned, bureaucracies vanished, and centuries of accumulated knowledge and technological sophistication were lost or fragmented. Yet from this chaos, new societies emerged, setting the stage for the Iron Age, which would redefine the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the Mediterranean. In mainland Greece, the collapse of Mycenaean palaces marked the beginning of a period traditionally referred to as the Greek Dark Ages, circa 1150 to 1000 BC. The fortified citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, once bustling centers of administration and commerce, were largely abandoned. Linear B writing, the administrative tool of the palace economy, disappeared, severing a crucial link to bureaucratic organization and record-keeping. Settlements became smaller, often relocated to defensible hilltops or inland locations, reflecting a shift toward localized survival rather than long-distance trade or palace-centered administration. Archaeological evidence, including simple ceramic styles and reduced monumental architecture, indicates a regression in technological and artistic complexity. Nevertheless, these communities laid the foundation for later political and social structures. Local chieftains exercised authority over smaller populations, establishing proto-polis structures that would eventually evolve into the city-states of the archaic and classical Greek periods. Crete, though previously dominated by Minoan civilization and later influenced by Mycenaean administration, also experienced significant transformation. Knossos and Phaistos show evidence of reduced occupation and simplified architectural patterns after c. 1200 BCE. The island's long-standing maritime trade networks were disrupted, limiting both economic prosperity and cultural exchange. However, Crete retained elements of its Minoan heritage, particularly in religious practices and trade, though reduced and more localized, began to recover in select areas. Phoenician maritime networks gradually expanded, connecting the Levant to Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. This period of recovery and adaptation laid the groundwork for the vibrant trade systems of the Iron Age, which would eventually facilitate the rise of Greek city-states, Phoenician maritime dominance, and new political formations across the Mediterranean. The decentralization of trade also fostered regional specialization, encouraging communities to focus on resources and crafts that could sustain them independently of distant empires. The collapse and subsequent recovery also had profound demographic and social consequences. Population density declined in formerly urbanized areas, with many communities relocating to defensible highlands or inland regions. The shift from large palatial economies to smaller, localized polities altered social hierarchies, reducing the dominance of palace elites, and increasing the importance of regional chieftains, kinship networks, and emerging aristocracies. This restructuring of society fostered flexibility and resilience, enabling communities to survive in a period of uncertainty while preserving enough continuity to rebuild cultural and political institutions in the centuries that followed. Despite the destruction and regression, the legacy of the Bronze Age persisted in ways that would shape the Iron Age Mediterranean. Knowledge of architecture, metallurgy, agriculture, maritime navigation, and religious practices survived through localized traditions and oral transmission. The collapse did not erase human ingenuity. Instead, it forced societies to adapt, innovate, and reorganize. By the end of the 10th century BCE, the foundations were being laid for the archaic Greek city-states, the resurgence of trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the rise of new political entities in Anatolia and the Levant, all of which would draw upon the experiences and achievements of the Bronze Age. In Greece, settlements slowly grew, fortifications re-emerged, and trade revived, though on a smaller scale. By c. 1000 BCE, the use of iron tools and weapons allowed communities to cultivate previously marginal lands and defend themselves effectively. These adaptations supported population growth, the re-establishment of local hierarchies, and the eventual emergence of the polis or city-state structure. In Anatolia, Neo-Hittite states maintained cultural continuity while developing independent political structures. In the Levant, Phoenician cities leveraged maritime expertise to dominate trade, spreading their influence throughout the Mediterranean. The period between 1150 and 1000 BCE illustrates a broader lesson about the resilience of human societies. While the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations represents one of history's most dramatic failures of complex interdependence, the post-collapse adaptation demonstrates the capacity of human communities to recover, innovate, and lay the groundwork for future civilizations. The Mediterranean, once fractured, gradually reconnected through new trade networks, technological advances, and cultural exchange, creating a foundation for the political and economic systems of the Iron Age. By the close of this transitional era, the Mediterranean world had undergone a profound transformation. Palatial economies had been replaced by smaller, decentralized political entities. Bronze had given way to iron. Urban complexity had decreased, but localized resilience increased. Trade networks were fragmented. Yet new connections were emerging, and cultural traditions persisted in adapted forms, informing the religions, arts, and governance of subsequent centuries. The lessons of collapse and recovery would resonate through the Iron Age and beyond, shaping the development of civilizations that would eventually achieve new heights of political, economic, and cultural achievement. The story of the Mediterranean Bronze Age, spanning roughly 3000 to 1000 BCE, is a narrative of human ambition, ingenuity, interconnection, and fragility. Across this millennium, societies transformed from small agrarian communities into complex civilizations whose achievements shaped the course of history. Crete witnessed the rise of the Minoans, constructing monumental palaces and fostering maritime trade that extended to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans emerged, fortified citadels dominating the landscape, while linear B tablets recorded a sophisticated bureaucratic and economic system. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire consolidated power, rivaling Egypt's new kingdom in military, political, and cultural influence. Along the Levantine coast, Ugarit and other city-states facilitated trade that knit together the eastern Mediterranean in a dense web of interdependence. The apex of this interconnected world was achieved between 1500 and 1200 BCE, when the Golden Trade Network allowed for the movement of tin from Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, gold from Egypt, and luxury goods from countless coastal ports. Artistic styles, religious practices, and technological innovations circulated alongside commodities, creating a vibrant, cosmopolitan Mediterranean. Yet, the very interdependence that underpinned prosperity also introduced systemic vulnerabilities. Environmental stress, droughts, crop failures, and shifting climates strained resources. Social unrest, internal rebellion, and succession disputes weakened political structures. The sudden appearance of the Sea Peoples disrupted trade and instilled fear across coastal settlements. Complex bureaucracies collapsed under pressure, leaving cities vulnerable and populations exposed. Between 1300 and 1200 BCE, these stresses became visible. Palaces burned, urban centers were abandoned or hastily fortified, and administrative systems crumbled. By 1200 to 1150 BCE, the Late Bronze Age collapse reshaped the Mediterranean entirely. Mycenaean palaces were destroyed, linear B writing disappeared, and the Hittite Empire dissolved. Ugarit was annihilated, and Egypt, though surviving under Ramesses III, faced repeated invasions and internal instability. Trade networks that had sustained interregional prosperity fractured, and centuries of accumulated knowledge and technology vanished, plunging much of the region into a dark age. Yet, even in destruction, resilience endured. Communities adapted, relocated, and innovated, laying the foundations for the Iron Age. From 1150 to 1000 BCE, the Mediterranean world slowly reorganized. Greek settlements transitioned into smaller, defensible communities, preserving fragments of Mycenaean culture while pioneering the social structures that would evolve into city-states. Neo-Hittite kingdoms and Anatolian polities maintained elements of Hittite administrative and cultural traditions, while Phoenician ports gradually rebuilt trade networks that would dominate maritime commerce for centuries. Iron technology replaced bronze, transforming agriculture, warfare, and craft production. Even in the aftermath of collapse, the ingenuity, adaptability, and continuity of human societies allowed the Mediterranean to recover and reimagine itself. The Mediterranean Bronze Age illustrates a timeless lesson about the duality of human civilization. Connectivity and prosperity can foster both remarkable achievement and profound vulnerability. The palaces of Crete and Mycenae, the trading networks of Ugarit and Phoenicia, and the imperial ambitions of the Hittites and Egyptians all demonstrate the heights societies can reach. Yet, when environmental, economic, social, and military pressures converge, the fragility of interdependence becomes starkly apparent. Around 1150 BCE, a wave of destruction swept the Mediterranean, leaving ruins, displaced populations, and unanswered questions about the societies that once flourished. And yet, the echoes of this era resonate through history. The innovations, artistic achievements, and cultural legacies of the Bronze Age informed the civilizations that arose in the Iron Age. The lessons of collapse, adaptation, and resilience would shape Greek city-states, Anatolian kingdoms, and Phoenician trade networks. The Mediterranean Bronze Age stands as both a monument to human ambition and a cautionary tale. Even the mightiest empires are vulnerable when prosperity outpaces resilience. It is a story of brilliance and fragility, of interconnected civilizations whose rise and fall continue to captivate historians, archaeologists, and anyone seeking to understand the forces that shape the destiny of human societies.